you know, the whole Conan thing, and it was very passionate, and like wind and all this stuff. What I always liked about his music was the big themes that sort of you can't forget, and the big, you know, the sweeping epic grandness of stuff like Farewell to the King and all that kind of thing. And to me, it felt very much like a sailor or a naturalist or environmentalist or someone who had this touch with something greater. He was not, you know, not that he didn't write wonderful intimate stuff as well, but he really, you could tell that his heart was sort of like it was like a storm.
But I always found that when I would work with Basil, which was many times, Summer Lovers, White Fang, Blue Lagoon, that when he would first sit down on his old piano and he would play the themes for me, that was when I could hear his genius and know purely how he was working with the music. And I liked that so much, that process, that when I came to do It's My Party, I told Basil that I only wanted him to use the piano and nothing else. Because I remembered every time we did a score and every time we'd sit at that piano, how pure it was. And so he resisted. He didn't want to he didn't want to be exposed like that. He said, I haven't played the piano for years. I feel like I'm not very good. And I said, no, you're very good. Believe me. And so rather than getting a big orchestra, let's just do it on the piano with you. And so what he did was he auditioned 90 pianos to find the perfect piano. And he was still quite nervous about that. And I kept encouraging him and telling him it was going to work. And so he did. He did the whole score on the piano and performed it. And I think it's one of his purest scores because it's just him.
Well, I was 8 years old, and like I said, my parents were always really encouraging of our expression of music and art and everything. And I went to a very free school where we, learned how to play music really early on. And I came home from school one day, and we had just learned to play the recorder. It's like a little plastic flute that kids play. And my father at the time didn't have a separate studio from the house. It was just a room across the hall from my bedroom. And we had all these wood floors in the house, and they were real hollow sounding. So back to that kind of hollow, sound. And the piano would resonate through the floorboards. And my father was up all night, working on stuff. And he was kind of stuck on this one progression. Da 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 ba da da ba all night, So I went to school, learned how to play this little instrument, and I had this thing in my head, da 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 da, and a melody came over the top. Da 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 da. And I went in, I started playing it along with him one day. And I guess it's technically the first jam session that I ever was involved with at age 8. And I remember him looking over and being like, all right. And he pushed record on the tape recorder, And I don't know, cut to like 2 weeks later, the whole family is like packed up. We're all going to Rome to record the big score of Conan and scoring sessions all day, every day. Everybody speaks Italian. It was an incredible trip for me as a child anyway. And one day, my dad looks back into the booth. Anyway, he looks back into the booth and he gestures for me to come out into the room. He's like, come here, I have a surprise for you. And so, what's that? So I go in, and he has me stand up on the podium with him, and he gives me the headphones, and then he starts conducting, and it's that refrain. Da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. But it's a 100-piece orchestra, all the woodwinds and all the strings are playing, and then huge percussion is in the background, and it's just this amazing thing. And then all of a sudden that melody comes over the top of it, played on French horns, I think, and bassoon, all these wind instruments. And I recognized it, and it was just this amazing moment where, oh my gosh, you really used that melody, and it's part of this now. And it was amazing. It was amazing. I'll never forget the feeling. So
I think while today we recognize Conan the Barbarian as an absolute classic of film music of the 1980s, and probably Basil's magnum opus, what is important from my point of view as a historian is the fact that Conan the Barbarian was not appreciated at the time it was released in 1982. If it was appreciated at all, it was by a handful of film music buffs. The problem was this spectacular piece of orchestral and choral music was attached to a film that was completely misunderstood by the American critical establishment. And that's why it's a shame now, in retrospect, that the music was not fully appreciated, not listed on anyone's honors list for that year. But today, with the passage of time, we now see what a great classic it was. The problem was the American critical establishment did not understand the sword and sorcery genre, which John Milius had translated so well into film, and which Basil had captured so brilliantly with his music. The primitive-sounding elements of the orchestra, the Latin choir chanting, the magical, mystical music for the wizards and the warriors, and that heartbreaking theme for Sandahl Bergman, especially in the end when she dies. That's all truly classic material, and I think it's a shame that it wasn't recognized at the time for what it really was, which was a landmark score, no question about it, in American film scoring.
actually, there was one before Conan, when I was a little younger, when he was working on the Blue Lagoon, and he had one of those really old-fashioned spring reverb units that you would sing into, and it kind of made your voice sound funny, or whatever instrument you played in front of it. And I used to go, I think it was under the piano, and I would go under there and I would like sing along to stuff. And while he was writing the Blue Lagoon, there was a sequence that I was singing along to, and he wrote it down. And I remember he always felt bad because he didn't give me credit for it. And I remember this from a little kid, and he didn't give me credit for that. So I think when the Conan thing came up, he was really excited to just push it as far as he could go. I got signed up as a member of BMI. I was on the cue sheet. I think on the actual album, if you turn it over, like it says my name real big, and people were like, "Who's that?" I was the 8-year-old daughter. So, and I think it's for a cue called The Orgy, which was always kind of funny. I didn't know when I was 8 what that was or anything, but I guess for his 8-year-old daughter to collaborate with him on a cue called The Orgy was definitely a little alternative.
Well, when I did Flesh and Blood, I had to present it to Orion, the rough cut, and of course by then I realized that in American cinema you had to give a soundtrack. So I collected all kind of music from American composers, in fact 3, which were Basil, Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner. And I basically used that as the soundtrack, as the music track of the movie. Later, when we started to score, to go into the scoring situation, Jerry was in fact not available at that time at all. James Horner saw it and Basil saw it. And James Horner didn't like it because he felt it was much too bloody. And Basil loved it because it was it has, of course, a certain parallelism, I would say, with Conan in some way, that it is rough and that the people are medieval or Conan, they are kind of living in older times, whatever. So I think Basil, for me, at that time, immediately became clear, in fact, that Basil was, for me, an epic music writer. I mean, he is somebody that at his best, and unfortunately he didn't get all the chances of his life to do that, because there are not that many epic movies anymore, they don't make that. And so, of course, if you look at older times, of course, there is especially his favorite composer, which was Miklos Rosa, who did Ben-Hur, for example, which is great music, and I think Basil is really a composer in that direction, but often looking for a tool, meaning a movie, where he could apply that, but as I said, they are not there.
I met Basil because I stalked Basil. Basil was my favorite unsung hero composer. I probably listened to the soundtrack of Blue Lagoon a million times? Nah, that's an understatement. A trillion times? I literally went through 4 vinyl copies of the Blue Lagoon soundtrack. Whenever I was in love with a girl, I would put it on. Whenever a girl broke up with me, I'd put it on. Whenever I wanted to go look at the water, I'd put it on. Whenever I wanted to look at Brooke Shields, I'd put it on. There's so many excuses to listen to the Blue Lagoon soundtrack, and I loved it. And then the same guy wrote Conan the Barbarian. And I would alternate. Conan the Barbarian, Blue Lagoon, Conan the Barbarian, Blue Lagoon, listening to him all the time. So when I moved to Los Angeles when I was 21 years old, I called directory information. I said, "Excuse me, can I please have the phone number for Basil Poledouris?" Figuring there couldn't be a whole lot of them. And he answered the phone and it's like, "Hi." I go, "Hi, I'm a fan of yours and I really love your music." And before I could even finish the sentence, he's like, "Hey, you want to come over for dinner?" And I was like, "Really?" So I drove in my little beat-up car to Basil Poledouris' house.
How I met Basil. My wife at the time, who wasn't my wife yet, she was my girlfriend, I was still in school, she was working with Richard Kraft. And Richard got a call from Basil that his programmer at the time on a movie called Celtic Pride contracted chickenpox. And somehow or another, Richard recommended that Basil should call me to see if I could, fit the gig. I got the call, and there was something very specific he asked me over the phone, whether or not I understood, inside and out, upside down and backwards, a Roland S760 sampler. I had a couple of them, but I only knew them from the standpoint of using them as a playback medium and not getting crazy with the sampling technology. So I lied through my teeth. I said, "Yep, know it," blindfolded. Got off the phone with him, ran to the manual, learned how to do certain things that he said I was going to have to do, showed up to the gig the next day, and that kind of began the relationship of me being his programmer and synth guy for about, I'd say, 7-year stretch.
This thing, whenever we did music was always very serious. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he stopped. You know what I mean? Like, when you're doing music, it's very serious, and he's amazing at it. But yeah, the focus definitely seemed to shift towards, living life. One morning, instead of working, we grabbed my wife, grabbed Mia, hopped on the boat, went down to Redondo Beach, had breakfast right on the water, just pull down there, dock the boat, get out, eat, hop back in the boat, drive back up, and then start playing the keyboard, I can't imagine anybody else I know doing that ever, just the stress and the pressure and the deadlines, to take that many hours out of a day to go do something like that was, I thought it was amazing.
He embraced life in such a full and rich manner. I mean, his family life, his life on the ocean, he was an avid surfer in his younger years and an avid sailor as he got older. He often said that music is like sailing and sailing is like music. It was an integral part of him. And you can actually hear his love for the ocean in scores like The Blue Lagoon or Wind or Big Wednesday or even Free Willy. There is something there. He was able to translate into music his passion for the open sea.
Basil Poledouris, Hardy, Viking, Bear, Warrior, Hobbit. As a matter of fact, he flew to New Zealand to meet on Lord of the Rings. Sean Astin, who you should interview, who he did a short film with, and Sean loved Basil. Basil said to Peter Jackson, "The guy you got to hire is Basil Poledouris." And so we conspired to get Basil to New Zealand. And Basil had never read the Lord of the Rings books, or he had read them back in college. And he read them, and he called me up and he goes, "Oh my God, these are the greatest books. It makes Star Wars look like Dr. Seuss. These things are magnificent." And in my mind, I made up that Basil was going to do the music for Lord of the Rings. And this was going to be Conan the Barbarian times 1,000. And then when he didn't get the job, I was so incredibly heartbroken.
Robocop was really an American movie, and I think then, of course, I approached Basil again because I felt it had the same kind of possible epic qualities and strengths in the orchestra. So, I mean, Basil works with the orchestra in a really different way than Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry is really wonderful when he integrates music with dialogue and all that. Basil is more for the big breezing, isn't it? The big gesture, and I think RoboCop in its exaggeration as a comic book needed something like, let's say, like a musical hyperbolic situation going beyond the norm, because RoboCop is beyond the norm, is it? I mean, it's superhuman, and so I felt that would be a perfect choice, and so then we did the second movie together, which was much more successful, and he got also prizes for that, for the music. In fact, I think he was very inspired, and I was very happy with the music. You know, I mean, the music became part of the movie in a very special way, and I cannot even separate them anymore. It's like, if I hear the music, I think RoboCop. If I see RoboCop, I think about the music, and it was really in every aspect a much more successful collaboration. Now that has a lot to do with working for the second time, you know, because the second time you're not afraid of each other anymore. You're not afraid to say something like, well, I don't like that.
So during the time that I was there, he was working on Starship Troopers, which was directed by Paul Verhoeven. So that was a very intense time because, as you can imagine, a lot of music in that film, and Paul's very intense. We had a lot of fun with him. But that was the project that I worked on mostly with him, you know, along with some side projects. But that was the project I managed at the studio for about a year.
That was a unique experience, certainly for me. Again, I can only talk from my perspective, but I would put that on a 13-week time frame, probably the longest I've ever been involved with a scoring process. Paul Verhoeven, an extremely intense person, and he and Basil had a great relationship. Paul would come over maybe twice, 3 times a week, and sit with us for an hour or two, sometimes 3 hours, and go through the mock-ups and express, as I said, very intensely, you know, what certain motifs should be, or what kinds of sound effects we were going to be dealing with that we either had to avoid or cut through.
Well, the great thing is Paul had confidence in Basil, so it wasn't like Paul was standing over him, watching him, you know, write every cue, but Basil still got pretty tortured over every piece of music that he ever wrote. So when he would have a listening session with Paul, I would have left him at maybe 7 o'clock at night, like, okay, go home and go to sleep, or not go home now, but get some sleep. And I'll have come home in the morning, he would have slept at the studio, you know, his hair would have been all disheveled, he wouldn't have had anything to eat, and because he was, you know, writing on his piano, which he did, pen and paper, on his piano, waiting for Paul to get there. But once Paul got there, it was always fine.
Basil was, you know, he really was a very old school sort of composer, dramatist. He was an old school dramatist. He would spend the time on the theme. He would really sit there, and it was, you know, and he would be sitting there with his old beat up piano with the cigarette marks in it, and that would be his duty, was to get that theme right and make the director hear his movie on the piano.
He wanted to be a resource for guys that were in the business, I guess almost specifically as composers, you know, younger guys coming up. Because we'd find ourselves many times, you know, out to dinner, having drinks or whatever, and we'd come across somebody, and it would turn into this 3-hour, you know, chat session. And a lot of guys would always want to pick his brain about, you know, obviously the volumes of work that he's done. And he would almost turn it right around and get more interested in them as, you know, aspiring composers and the technologies they're using and the techniques that they're employing. I mean, he was just as much interested in everybody else's story as we were with his.
Basil relished his real, you know, artistic relationships, his long-term relationships, like Milius and like Randall and like Verhoeven and that kind of thing. He really loved working with someone who trusted him and who knew what they wanted from him, and vice versa.
My father, through his career, was always very generous. He was a very generous man. I think anybody would say that about him. But with his children, especially with me, you know, he was very generous with, I always got to be involved. You know, I think we all, my whole family, we all felt involved. It was like a family effort. It was a group effort, especially, you know, my mother, they were like partners. You know, he couldn't do anything without her. She was always in the wings. And after every cue would finish on the scoring stage, she would look over, you know, there would be the director and the engineer and then my mom. So it was like this, the Holy Trinity he would look back at, after every cue to make sure everything was okay.
It really taught me a lesson about the importance of family and relationships. And they were so involved with each other, and she was so involved in his career. And it was always this moment, it was without fail, where Basil would be out conducting. Basil did all his own conducting. And I'd be at the board, and Bobby would be sitting down at the end, usually next to the orchestrator or the reader or whoever. And there'd be this moment where a melody would pop out, and it would be the melody of the film. I mean, there was always 3 or 4 different themes, but a melody would pop out, and Bobby and I would just turn our heads and just look at each other with this wry little smile, knowingly, saying, there it is, there's Basil. And it was, I'm getting chills just thinking about those moments now. He was an amazing writer.
Basil and I shared over 35 years together, a lifetime of wonderful memories. The births of our 2 daughters, watching him conduct full orchestras all over the world, weeks spent sailing on our boat off the coast of California. But I guess if there was one memory I'd like to share with you today, it would be the sound of Basil playing his piano. Often I would wake up in the middle of the night, well after midnight, and I'd hear the sound of a new melody, a melody that would one day become the theme to Conan the Barbarian, or Free Willy, or Lonesome Dove. Nothing will ever touch me as deeply as the sound of Basil playing his piano in the middle of the night.
It's definitely one of the memories that is the most powerful, I think, because from the time I was born, there was music. The day they brought me home from the hospital, he got Big Wednesday, and to this day, I hear Big Wednesday and I hear the story of my life. I remember hearing his music and feeling like it was my own soundtrack. It was a soundtrack for our family. And I'm so thankful to have this music to share with the world, but also because it's like an emotional scrapbook for me. I can put in a CD or watch Red Dawn or something, and all these memories come back, things that I haven't thought of for years, and thoughts of my father at the piano and being a kid, and in the music I hear our story. And I feel like it's also a way to look at the past, but also continue a relationship with him now that he's gone. And I'm very happy to have that.
And that's what he gave me. And I'll be certainly, enormously thankful, of course, basically, for the friendship that he gave me, also the friendship his family gave me, in fact. The help, the support that he gave me, a foreigner coming to the United States without knowing anything and being, let's say, accepted in his family, with my family, all that. But on top of that, very importantly, the common musical ideals that we had, I think, and really I feel that music is probably the most beautiful art form that's possible, because it's immediately so emotional if you do it well, of course. But yeah. And he did. So yeah, we're sitting here, and it's a sorrowful situation, that he passed away, and he was only 61. It's just, he could have worked like Jerry another 20 years.
I think Basil's loss to the film music community is huge, for many reasons. He was part of a generation that came up right behind the Williams and the Goldsmith crowd. He came on the scene in the 1970s, along with people like Bruce Broughton and John Scott and David Shire, a kind of new generation that embraced the old values and traditions of American film music, but also brought a new, younger perspective. So that came about in the 1970s, and throughout his work in the 80s and 90s, we kept seeing great score after great score. I think you can fairly and legitimately say that at least a half a dozen of Basil's scores are among the greatest film music accomplishments in the 80s and 90s. And so his loss is, I think, keenly felt, especially in an era when melody seems less valued than ever in film music. Not just one of the last great romantics, Basil was one of the great melodists of our time. And we miss that, and we don't have that so much anymore. And I think if he was still writing and still active and with us today, I think he would be writing circles around a lot of people who are considered A-list composers. He had an innate dramatic sense. Not only was he a great melodist, he knew when to lay back and when to jump forth full throttle with a great tune. But he also was able to work in so many genres and do so brilliantly. I think his loss is keenly felt today.
Guy represented kind of all things that you can represent: the mentor, the brother, the father, the colleague, the friend. I mean, all these things wrapped up in one. You know, he truly represented that in my life, where I can't really think of another person in my life that encapsulated all of those dynamics. And you know, when you recognize how important somebody is to your life, and it's, you know, interesting, just the last few days, again, in preparation for this, I've been thinking to myself what a sounding board he has been as a mentor, friend, and, you know, now, like, that's not there. It's pretty heavy, you know, it still kind of hits me, so.
My father was not always the most accepting person of his own talents and what it was bringing to him. He was almost too humble for his own good, you know. Which it's a blessing and a curse, because I think he was humble enough to kind of let the stuff be really genuine. He never forced anything; it was never phony. He was a very genuine man, and his art reflected that genuine quality in him. And I think that he didn't understand why people liked the music so much. He never did. He really didn't. And I think only at the very